Hi everyone, hope you're very well. I thought I'd do a post today with my wonderful mentee Alex from the UEA. I'm a volunteer with the UEA, have been for many years. And Alec and I met some time ago, and I put a post up recently about the the Ukraine war. That's an issue of contention, and it turned into a kind of, not exactly a bloody argument, but it did turn into a lot of contentious issues flying around. I thought it would be good just to put the debate, have a conversation about it and explore this issue in a bit more detail, just because the whole point about this war is that there are so many different opinions, so many different motivations, so many different perspectives, all battling themselves out, and it's really difficult to know what to think. I personally find that very difficult often with political issues, is that I don't really know what you can read reliably and which opinion has as much weight as another. So I thought it would be good to do a debate. Just before we do that, though, I just want to tell you that Alec and I have known each other for some time now. And originally, as a mentee, he was interested in getting some work with the MOD, but because of his nationality, he wasn't eligible for a post. And originally, that was a massive disappointment to him. But I'm delighted to say that so much has happened since then. Why don't you just tell us a little bit about what you've done since then?
So, yeah, obviously with the MOD it didn't work out, but it wasn't a temperamental fit that worked anyway, and that was something that kind of Naomi helped me figure out, and I kind of figured out over time. So I started getting into journalism. That gained some traction. I wrote for a youth think tank, just on some kind of topics like, Turkish foreign policy and things like that. And then I also am now going to be potentially writing some research for the European Institute of Asian Studies. I'm also potentially going to be speaking to the BBC as well for a youth kind of a show on kind of youth talent. So different young people doing different things, and it's kind of just exploring what they're doing.
Awesome. And then there's conversations too. I mean, on the one hand, Alec is on a master program now, just happened to mention that he might be pursuing a PhD. And I say this just because when it comes to careers and moving in the directions and making selections, etc., it's always really important to remember who you are by nature. So one of the things that Alex said to me really early on was that he doesn't like rules. And I was like, so why would you think that you'd be a natural fit at the MOD if you don't like rules? And so it was the fact that he was applying, because he thought it was appropriate for him, but at the same time didn't really consider that in terms of who he was, it probably wasn't going to work anyway. So I just wanted to use this as an example to show you that when you're doing anything with careers, you're thinking about your future, you start with you, not what's out there. Okay? Alright, so we've prepared some questions for you. Probably this is going to be quite a heavy debate. We'll try and keep it to around 10 minutes. But, okay, let's think about where we are. So one of the biggest questions, I mean, a lot of these are outdated on a daily basis, but let's just start somewhere. Would you describe this as a united Russia, or would you describe this as Putin's war?
I think when you're looking at Russia, basically anything done on a foreign policy level is Putin's war. But unfortunately, that means that fundamentally the Russian state is always acting in Putin's interest, and it's hard to tell the difference. And what's interesting about Russia is, in general, domestic constituents don't really matter. So the people don't really guide policy. So whenever you're looking at anything like that, it's not just going to be Putin, but it's going to be a strategic circle of people close to Putin that are driving everything.
Okay. And not to mention, there's a wonderful interview with Julia Ioffe, who's an expert in this field, and she was saying that Putin's closest cabinet members were not really au fait with what was happening. I don't think anybody expected the reaction to be as dramatic as this. We've seen reactions from the Russian public, a lot of shock and horror, resignations at national TV stations. So it does seem to be a divided country. I think we can pretty much settle on the fact that having this idea that Russia is completely united in its support for this mission is probably not very accurate.
I think it also is saying it goes both ways, though. So there is an overemphasis of kind of millions of Russians being out on the street. That is not true. Now, I'm going to say why that's not just down to them being Putinists, but it is maybe tens of thousands of people out on the street. And the people who aren't out on the street are out for different reasons, but it definitely is a divided house. So there's not just loads of loyalists or loads of opposition to this. It's kind of a mixed bag.
Okay. And I think that's the important point, and this came up in the kind of conflict, I guess you would call it, on Facebook. But there is a difference of motivation, there is a difference of perspective, there's a difference of person. There's just a lot of difference and variety in the voices in this conversation. And so having this idea that there's one or the other is just really misguided. So I think this is why conversation is useful.
And I think it's also just context as well. So a Ukrainian telling that the Russians need to be braver about protesting makes a lot of sense because these people are actually invaded and they're actually justified in making that criticism. Whereas people from the West observing, saying, why aren't they fighting harder against this, don't understand that unlike in the countries they are, where you can protest to some degree quite freely, in Russia, you don't know if the protest will actually work to begin with, and you're risking a lot by just participating in them. And it's not so obvious that, if you're a father or a mother, that's a risk that's worth taking.
Okay, yeah, really interesting. Okay, next question. So, wait, we were talking, actually, can I change the question? We were talking earlier on about the different types of... Every time I have a question about anything to do with conflict, I go to Alec because he knows things about weapons and different types of military equipment that most people don't know. So could you just tell us what's going on? What did you say about the Ukrainians and their ownership now of 550 pieces of, say, whatever? So we're just going to talk about the weapons, and it'll give you a sense of where we are in this conflict. Because if we look at the numbers, if we look at the number of days, if we look at, international relations in the news, it doesn't really give you a clear picture of what it's like on the ground. But when you look at weapons and you look at what's happening to those weapons and what's happening to the tanks and the level of drone technology, this gives you another perspective. So I think it's really useful to do that.
So basically, this conflict is questioning every assumption that people have about land warfare. So the first is this idea that tanks matter nowadays. And what we found is actually that a lot of tanks have been captured, a lot of tanks have been destroyed on the Russian side. And the Ukrainians have captured ground force equipment, so tanks, artillery. They've captured about 550 pieces of it, and this is visually confirmed by independent open source analysts who look at pictures and geolocate them and verify all of it.
Right.
So these are probably conservative estimates because there's a lot of stuff that isn't being filmed.
And what does that suggest in terms of morale, in terms of why this is happening, do you think? Can you comment?
So I think it's a few things. The first thing is that tanks in the modern application seem to be quite useless, especially with the equipment that the Ukrainians have been given. So after annexation happened, and after Euromaidan happened in 2014, the Americans and NATO allies ran into a project of basically training up the Ukrainians and giving them weapons like javelins, stingers. So javelins basically, I believe, hit targets on the ground. So they will basically deliberately, rockets that will go up high in the air, find a weak point in a tank, so maybe the top part of it, which is the most vulnerable, and kind of hit it like that.
Right.
And stingers will basically lock on to targets and to air targets and basically hit them. And they're very hard to evade.
Right.
So what it meant is any of the conventional measures of force were very limited in their impact, and which is why you saw a disastrous attempt at a 3-day blitz by the Russians that, for all intents and purposes, it's safe to say failed quite hard, because maybe there was an overestimation by the Russians of their strength when they attacked.
But that's something that I've read a lot in the news, is that the Russians have they're the military power between the two countries in terms of the numbers. I mean, how can you comment on, are you saying that the quality of Ukrainian equipment is stronger, or maybe not unanimously?
So there's a few factors. So in air capabilities, people are talking about a lot, how upset they are that the Americans didn't give the Ukrainians MiGs. The problem is with that narrative is that there's an assumption that doesn't mean that they don't have any other air capabilities, which is not true. They have Bayraktar TB2 Turkish drones.
You need to explain. These are all new words to me.
Okay, so Bayraktar is the Turkish company that made very cheap drones that started being used by loads of countries.
Okay.
And effectively, they are drones that can fly up and basically hit targets on the ground. And drone technology is something that Russia doesn't really have.
Right.
And Ukrainians procured it by buying it off the Turks, and they've been able to hit a lot of targets with them. The Russians haven't been able to shoot them down, and that's inflicted substantial losses. Plus, the Ukrainians seem to be using them very smartly in a way that means that they're not losing them at high rates.
Right.
I think the other conversations worth having as well is context of war. So if it was like a conventional war, maybe in the medieval period where people would pick a plot of land and kind of fight there, and it was very all on the ground, the Russians would probably win. But that's not how war is fought, and the Russians are invading a country and basically fighting an insurgent population. Population that knows its land, population that doesn't fight in one linear army, that fights in detachments and groups, and, despite having a size disadvantage, can actually strike Russian targets to great effect. And the final bit is morale, obviously. For the Ukrainians, it's a question of, we're protecting our land, there's no ifs or buts. Whereas for the Russians, they have a very small professional army, which are demotivated in themselves. You have conscripts going in, which are basically 18-year-olds that are drafted in, not really knowing what the hell is going on.
And tell them what you told me earlier on about them just walking straight into... This is so hard to hear, to be honest.
So you can tell the quality of Russian troops by how they're acting on the kind of the battle stage, which I guess is Ukraine. And what you're noticing is there's videos of conscripts in Russia walking, quite stupidly in military terms, directly on roads, not in staggered formations like you're supposed to, but walking in compact columns. And that makes them very easy targets for the Ukrainians. And it is those conscripts that are suffering the most because they don't have any of the training that, Spetsnaz forces will have, which is the Russian Special Forces or the infantry, that will know better than to walk in open areas like that.
That's so tragic. I think the reality is, however much we interpret things from political points of view, at the end of the day, there are people just being killed. And
I think there's a real important thing to distinguish between Western militaries and Russian militaries. The West has pursued a successful policy of professionalizing the forces. So what that means is civilians aren't drafted. Anyone who fights for America or the United Kingdom's doing so willingly. They're being paid. Whereas in Russia, there was a project to try and get this to try and get the whole army professional, but it failed. And it was a reform that the Russians tried to pursue, but it failed miserably. After Chechnya and Afghanistan, which is conflicts that Russia fought in, no one really had a good image of the Russian army. There was incidents of Russian teenagers being hazed, being raped in these training camps, and this threw off loads of people from the Russian army. So they couldn't get in enough people to professionalize it, so they've had to rely on conscripts as well.
Right.
And conscripts don't make good fighters. They're low on morale. They're ineffective. And they're especially bad at attacking land. They're good at defending land, but very useless at attacking land because they will run away at the first sight of combat. So,
this is so hard to hear. Oh, okay, we have to change subject now.
Mm-hmm.
So that, I hope, has given you some insight into the complexity of this type of debate. I mean, just the vocabulary alone, the different types of weaponry. It's so important to get a sense of these details to interpret what the nature of this conflict really is, One last question, then we'll start, but and it's an impossible question, but where are we looking? What are we looking at?
So it depends on a lot of hearsay. So there's people saying there's a peace deal in the making. Some people are questioning whether that's even true, whether it's a Kremlin lie. But even if it is true, there's a question of whether the terms are acceptable for the Ukrainians and which Ukrainians. So Zelensky is, before this war, was actually quite pragmatic towards wanting to kind of work out with the Russians how to solve the civil war, how to maybe allow the separatist enclaves some autonomy. So Donetsk and Lugansk may be allowing them to be closer to Russia.
This is in the east, yeah.
In the east of Ukraine, yeah. Where there's others who don't want to stop fighting. Because they believe that if Russia gets away with keeping this territory, they've effectively been incentivized to break international law, to act aggressively towards Ukraine. And there's also quite high morale in the Ukrainian army, and dwindling morale in the Russian army. And the Ukrainians have also been very good at information warfare. So making it look like they're destroying the Russians decisively. The statistics show that they might be doing that to some degree, but as the narrative makes it seem like that's even more the case. Mm-hmm. Which is funny because everyone was talking about how Russia is this savvy information warfare kind of actor, but it seems the Ukrainians have actually outmatched them on that.
Okay, awesome. I hope that you found that interesting, and I love this point that we end on, that the statistical story and the narrative story are two different things.
And it comes from both sides, of course. Russia is only just admitting now that they've sent conscripts, and they're really underestimating the amount of numbers deliberately of people that they've actually lost in the combat, which is a good sign for the Ukrainians and probably a very bad sign for powerful people in Russia.
Okay, thank you so much, Alec. That was awesome. I'm so pleased for you. I'm so proud of you for doing so well and everything. And if you have any questions about this conflict, this is your man, because anytime I have a question about conflict, I go straight to him. Okay, guys, have a great night. Bye.
Bye.